in 2017 that this month must be recognized as the Rastafari month. And that's why we are here in support of Ibrahim Traore.
After the coup attempt on Traore, something insane happened. Everyone, including African locals and people worldwide, started supporting Traore. But why would millions cheer for a man the West calls dangerous? And what if this wasn't just a failed coup, but the failure of an entire empire? Let's find out. Coup attempts are supposed to terrify a country. They are meant to destabilize, to confuse, to open the door for foreign interference while the people are still in shock. But when the recent plot to remove Captain Ibrahim Traore was uncovered and crushed, the opposite happened. Ouagadougou didn't fall silent. It exploded with rage, music, fire, fists raised, and voices roaring across every street. Something fundamental broke in that moment. Not the government, not the military, but the illusion that Africa was still on a leash. For decades, this has been the game. The moment a leader in Africa steps too far outside the lines drawn by Paris, Washington, or Brussels, the script is activated. Rumors of a coup, whispers of instability. Suddenly, shadowy groups emerge, funding appears, military insiders are turned, and chaos takes the stage. Sometimes the leader disappears. Sometimes the uprising succeeds. But this time, it didn't. And that failure mattered more than anything Traore has ever said in a speech. It proved that even when the empire pulled the oldest trick in the book, it didn't work. And now, every African paying attention is asking, what else have they lied about? The attempted overthrow was sloppy, not just in execution, but in timing. It came after months of rising popular support for Traore, following decisions that many outside observers called reckless, but the people called necessary. Expelling French troops, closing military bases, nationalizing Burkina Faso's gold, speaking openly of African unity beyond ECOWAS, and forging security alliances with Mali and Niger. These were not quiet diplomatic moves. These were seismic shifts, and they made Traore a target. But they also made him untouchable to the masses. So when whispers of betrayal leaked and soldiers were caught, something strange happened. The people didn't wait for permission to respond. They didn't wait for instructions from ministers or journalists. They went to the streets, and they stayed there. Some held signs with slogans like, "Hands off our revolution." Others simply carried photos of Traore like icons. Many weren't even political. They were farmers, students, welders, grandmothers, all saying one thing: you can't take this from us. And it wasn't just Burkina Faso. In Mali and Niger, rallies flared up in support. Across West Africa, youth forums began circulating videos and manifestos. In Johannesburg, hundreds marched to the French consulate, demanding an end to foreign interference. Even in cities like London and Montreal, African diaspora groups staged flash protests and online campaigns, calling the coup not just an attack on one man, but on the spirit of a new Africa rising. This spontaneous reaction wasn't just political. It was psychological. It marked the death of something invisible but powerful, the fear that nothing could ever change. When Traore didn't fall, when the military didn't splinter, when the people refused to go home, a collective voice rang out, one that generations had kept buried beneath despair in history books. We are no longer afraid of you. The failed coup did more than reinforce Traore's power. It triggered a continent-wide audit of loyalty. Who still stands with the colonizers? Who benefits from instability? Who wants Africa divided and weak? These questions began to haunt not just Western embassies, but also leaders in neighboring capitals who had been too quiet for too long. It forced a public line in the sand. Silence was no longer neutral. It was betrayal. And for Traore himself, the failure gave him something more valuable than power: momentum. His speeches began to shift tone, less defensive, more prophetic. He no longer spoke as someone leading a government. He spoke as someone leading a generational mission. The rhetoric of coups and power faded. In its place, he started using words like liberation, dignity, and legacy. He wasn't just speaking to citizens, he was speaking to his ancestors. That's what the West still doesn't understand. To them, this is geopolitics. To many Africans, This is spiritual, a cleansing, a reckoning, a long overdue reversal of roles. And every time they try to reduce it to strategy, they miss the heartbeat behind it. The people have chosen someone who finally talks like them, looks like them, walks among them, and doesn't blink in front of their enemies. This is what made the coup's failure so powerful. Not because Traore was saved, but because the system that wanted him gone proved it couldn't finish the job. That system, one that whispered in generals' ears, that manipulated bank accounts, that wrote press releases about constitutional order while holding knives behind its back system, showed its hand and failed. And now, it can never play the same trick again. So the question becomes, if the old methods no longer work, what does the West have left? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The moment the coup collapsed, Western strategists retreated to familiar territory. Their fallback terrain of subtle sabotage, narrative control, and international pressure. They assumed that if they couldn't remove Traore with force, they could still dismantle him with shame. Accusations were prepared. Human rights watchdogs dusted off their usual templates. Headlines emerged warning of militarization and democratic backsliding. Editorials in Paris, Washington, and Geneva painted a dark portrait of a young leader steering a fragile nation into ruin. But something went wrong. Again. The message didn't land. That's because the people weren't waiting for foreign headlines to decide how they felt. The very attempt to smear Traore only deepened his appeal. Young Africans who once took Western outlets seriously now scrolled past their critiques with open contempt. It wasn't just that they disagreed, it's that they no longer believed those voices had the right to speak on African affairs at all. And in their place, something new emerged. A decentralized network of African bloggers, community broadcasters, street poets, and digital warriors who dismantled every Western accusation with ruthless precision and viral speed. Every narrative thrown at Traore ricocheted back at its author. The more they called him a threat, the more the streets treated him like a shield. The more they claimed he was destabilizing the region, the more citizens praised him for disrupting the wrong kind of stability, the kind built on foreign soldiers and economic dependency. The attempt to isolate him diplomatically didn't just fail. It turned Traore into a magnet for those who felt excluded, dismissed, or punished by the international order. Mali and Niger leaned in harder. Guinea and Chad began recalculating. And Pan-African organizations that once hesitated found themselves facing their base, now demanding clarity. Are you with the people or with the puppets? But the West didn't stop there. Sanctions began to whisper in. International lenders grew colder. Development assistance was reviewed. These were the levers that had toppled regimes before. But once again, Traore didn't flinch. Instead, he delivered speeches that turned punishment into proof. If they deny us aid, he told a rural crowd, it is because we refuse to be slaves. That line didn't just echo. It thundered. It ended up graffitied on market walls, repeated in WhatsApp voice notes, and printed on homemade t-shirts. The message was clear. Suffering under pressure was no longer a sign of failure. It was a badge of resistance. And behind every speech, Traore deployed action. Not empty defiance, but concrete pivots. Burkina Faso turned to local production schemes. Rice programs were expanded, gold was refined inside the country instead of being shipped away. Deals were signed with Russia for grain and security, and informal bartering channels were explored with North Korea and Iran. What looked like desperation from afar was, on the ground, an experiment in strategic survival, a blueprint for autonomy that others were watching closely. But perhaps the most potent weapon Traore wielded was symbolic defiance. He began rejecting Western invitations. He stopped playing nice at summits where African voices were tokenized. When Western leaders issued thinly veiled warnings, he didn't beg or explain. He ignored them. And that silence was louder than any protest. It said, "You no longer matter here." It was a psychological rupture in the post-colonial script. For too long, African leadership was conditioned to seek validation from former masters. But Traore flipped the axis. He became the one whose attention others sought. That shift did something deeper than politics. It altered the atmosphere. Suddenly, people weren't dreaming of visas to Europe. They were dreaming of passports that carried African pride. They weren't praising the World Bank. They were debating how to build a West African Development Fund. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about building a world where the West isn't needed. That's what scares them the most. Because every failure to stop Traore only builds his myth. Every slap turns into a sermon. Every restriction becomes a revolution. They've accidentally made him immortal, not through death, but through resilience. They've created a paradox. The harder they try to discredit him, the more credible he becomes to his people. The more they try to isolate him, the more credible he becomes to his people. The more they try to isolate him, the more connected he becomes to the Pan-African psyche. And now, they don't know what to do. If they stop attacking him, he wins. If they keep attacking him, he wins bigger. He has become a symbol they cannot kill, a narrative they can't control, and a fire they can't put out. And with every passing week, more young Africans are realizing, maybe we don't need to beg anymore. Maybe we don't need to ask for respect. Maybe we need to take it. But there's one more fear haunting them, the one they never say aloud. What if Traore is proof that Africa doesn't need them at all? To misunderstand Traore is to miss the most dangerous part of his message. He is not begging for a seat at the table. He's building a different table. That, more than any expulsion of troops or rejection of aid, is the deepest offense. Because if there's one thing worse than a rebel in the eyes of the West, it's a leader who no longer needs to rebel because he's moved on. This is what makes Traore more than a revolutionary. He's a rupture. He doesn't just reject the global order. He shows it's no longer relevant. His every action communicates one silent message. You're not the center of gravity anymore. That's why the sanctions don't sting the way they used to. That's why media attacks bounce off. That's why every punishment lands like a tantrum, not a threat. This shift didn't happen in one speech. It has been accumulating like tectonic pressure beneath the surface of Africa for decades. What Traore did was trigger the quake. His leadership marks a generational line in the sand. Before him, African leaders operated in two categories: collaborators who survived by playing nice with their former colonizers, or rebels who died trying to escape. Traore doesn't fit either category. He's not asking for recognition. He's operating as if it no longer matters. That unnerves the West because it undermines their greatest illusion, that they are still the sun and Africa a satellite. But now, Traore is saying openly what many whispered in fear. The world has changed, and Africa doesn't need to orbit anyone. This isn't just about Burkina Faso. It's about the deeper threat Traore represents, a new African center of agency, one that doesn't rely on Washington's approval, Paris's funding, or Brussels' validation. In the vacuum left by fading Western influence, Traore has begun constructing something that terrifies diplomats and think tanks alike, a new logic of power. This logic says development doesn't have to come from donors. Trade doesn't have to bow to old routes. Military strength doesn't have to mean foreign bases. And sovereignty isn't a diplomatic formality. It's a lived, enforced, and protected reality. In this logic, alliances are formed with those who respect you, not with those who colonized you and now call it cooperation. That's why partnerships with Russia, China, North Korea, and even Iran aren't just tactical, they're symbolic. They say, we will not be cornered anymore. This is not about ideology, it's about dignity. These moves announce to the world that African nations can pick their own friends, define their own interests, and write their own futures, even if those futures don't include Western approval. And this is where the psychological damage to the West begins. Because Traore is not just defying them, he is eclipsing them. Every successful pivot away from the Western grip is a strike at the heart of the global hierarchy that assumes Africa will always be developing, never developed. A continent to be managed, not one to be feared. But when Traore talks about refining gold locally, launching a national bank, or trading outside the dollar system, he isn't just talking economics. He's talking about a new African self-image, one that no longer sees itself as broken. That's the real revolution. Not the coups, not the speeches, but the shift in African self-perception. And that shift is contagious. You see it in the way students talk in universities across Ghana and Tanzania, in the way young politicians in Senegal are redefining their campaigns. In this way, artists, TikTokers and activists are rejecting imported frameworks and speaking in unapologetically local voices. Traore didn't cause this wave. He gave it a name. And the West? They're stuck trying to fight a war that has already moved to a different battlefield. Their weapons, media pressure, diplomatic isolation, economic carrots and sticks, were designed for a world where Africa wanted their approval. But what do you do when your opponent simply stops caring what you think? You can't bribe someone who no longer wants your money. You can't shame someone who calls your criticism a badge of honor. Traore's strategy isn't confrontation, it's substitution. He's replacing their systems with alternatives. His alliances are not just diversifying Burkina Faso's options, they are mocking the old binary choice Africa was always given: submit or suffer. Now there's a third option: stand tall and partner laterally. And that third option? It's beginning to spread. The West is learning too late that its power relied not just on armies or money, but on belief. The belief that they were essential. But as that belief evaporates, so does their control. And in that space, men like Traore rise, not as rebels, but as reminders. Reminders that colonial power was never eternal, that the age of foreign dictation is ending, and that the next chapter won't be written in Paris. It'll be written in Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey, or maybe even Kinshasa, Addis, and Harare. So the question now is not, how long can Traore survive? The real question is, how long can the West deny that they've already lost the argument? They've tried everything else. Now only one option remains: force. Whether through a puppet coup, drone surveillance, black budget mercenaries, or multilateral interventions under the disguise of humanitarian aid, the West may still be foolish enough to press the red button. But if they do, they won't just be stepping into Burkina Faso, they'll be stepping into a furnace. Because here's the new reality they still pretend doesn't exist. Burkina Faso is no longer isolated. It sits in the middle of something much larger now, not just geographically but symbolically. It's the center of the AES alliance, the rising military and political bloc formed with Mali and Niger. These aren't random neighbors. These are three post-coup states that have chosen to exit the old order together, each one a different note in the same resistance anthem. They coordinate military strategy, they synchronize anti-insurgency operations, and they share one unbreakable rule: an attack on one is an attack on all. So what happens if the West decides to remove Traore? They will ignite a regional fire that no think tank model has properly accounted for. AES troops, already hardened by real conflict, will mobilize instantly. Borders will close. Defense zones will light up. Intelligence will go dark. Western embassies won't be safe havens. They'll be evacuation points. Every soldier parachuted into Burkina Faso will walk into hostile terrain where civilians aren't passive bystanders. They're co-combatants with a cause. It won't be a battlefield. It'll be a funeral for foreign influence. But that's just the military side. The bigger detonation will be psychological, and it will spread faster than any missile. The moment word gets out that the West orchestrated another African overthrow, especially one targeting a leader widely seen as a symbol of dignity, protests will erupt across the continent. We're not talking about a few tweets or press statements. We're talking about entire cities shutting down. African youth who once wore Western brands will burn them in the streets. Politicians who once played it safe will be forced to pick sides or be swallowed whole. Countries like Guinea, Algeria, Ethiopia, and even Congo will feel the pull. The idea of a West-backed government will become toxic overnight. And the diaspora? They won't stay quiet either. They've already shown that when Africa bleeds, they bleed louder. From Times Square to Trafalgar Square, African communities abroad have been watching, organizing, recording every insult, every threat, every coup attempt. If Traore is attacked, expect them to flood digital spaces with evidence, fire, and fury. Expect protests at embassies. Expect mass online campaigns that drag down the carefully managed Western narrative and expose the empire's fingerprints. Even African leaders who privately doubt Traore will find themselves on thin ice. Public sentiment will be impossible to ignore. If they support the intervention, they'll be labeled traitors. If they stay silent, they'll be accused of cowardice. The populist tide will rise, sweeping aside anyone who appears aligned with Western aggression. Elections will shift, cabinets will fall, regimes that once ruled comfortably under US and French partnerships will start feeling the heat. One wrong statement, and they're next. And let's not forget the international chessboard. Russia and China have made it clear. They see Africa as more than a trade partner. They see it as the future. Russia has boots on the ground already. China controls critical infrastructure and mineral supply chains. Any Western assault on Traore will look like a provocation. And in a multipolar world, provocations don't go unanswered. The Sahel could quickly become a proxy battlefield, with consequences echoing far beyond Africa. The economic fallout alone would be staggering. Disrupted trade routes, attacks on French and American assets, spikes in gold and energy prices, markets panicking. And for what? To remove a man who told his people they deserved better? The irony is thick. In trying to suppress Traore, the West will only magnify him. He'll become more than a leader. He'll become a martyr without dying. His face will be painted on walls in Lagos, Khartoum, and Nairobi. His speeches will be replayed at every protest. His name will outlive every Western general who tried to erase it. This is the cost of arrogance. The West still imagines that it can control African destinies with the same tools it used in the 1960s. But the terrain has shifted. The tools are blunt, the people are awake, and the illusion of untouchable Western authority has cracked. Traore's continued survival already proves that. But if they push harder, if they go too far, they may not just lose Africa's trust. They may lose Africa itself. So what happens if they still try? They walk into a trap they set for themselves, armed with outdated assumptions and blind to the fact that the battlefield has moved. The empire still believes it's playing chess, but the board is burning. So, do you think the West will again make the same mistake? If yes, how would the Africans react? Let us know in the comments section. Are we about to witness a war? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.